Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 24, Yet More Contemporaneous Rebellions. Over the last few episodes, we've looked at the Glorious Revolution in England, which replaced the Catholic James II with the Protestant monarchs William and Mary. The Glorious Revolution inspired similar rebellions in Boston and New York against the hated Dominion of New England. Today, we're going to talk about how the Glorious Revolution played out in the southern colonies. Even though there hadn't been the same sort of big reorganization as in the northern colonies, there was still discontent, and the Glorious Revolution would also lead to rebellions in Maryland and North Carolina. These other revolts weren't coordinated with the revolts against the Dominion, but it is notable how much synchronization there was between them, even though they did occur independently. We'll begin with Maryland. It's been a little while since we've spent much time in the Chesapeake, so let me remind you of where we left off, around 1680. The Chesapeake was of course divided between Maryland to the north and the much larger Virginia to the south. Virginia was a royal colony ruled directly by the king, but Maryland was a proprietary province ruled by the Calvert family as their personal fiefdom. That wouldn't have been too much of a problem but for one terrible fact. The Calverts were a Catholic family, while Maryland's population was overwhelmingly Protestant. And the Calverts, who had pretty much absolute power within the colony, made sure that many of the top offices remained in the hands of Catholics. The current proprietor, Charles Calvert, the 3rd Baron Baltimore, was actually living in the colony, which gave him even more direct control. Naturally, there was a great deal of friction and hostility between the populace and their rulers. Marylanders were persistently worried about the specter of Catholic tyranny, and they were quick to revolt against the government. They even succeeded in overthrowing it several times, although power always wound up back in the hands of the Baltimores. Conditions in both colonies had been worsening for some time. Tobacco prices were low, taxes were high, the Indians were raiding, and the region's defenses were weak. In Virginia, the discontent culminated in Bacon's Rebellion, one of the biggest uprisings in the American colonies before the Revolution. Bacon's Rebellion ended in the total victory of the government, after Bacon himself died. At the end of the revolt, the English government sent a force to Virginia and began taking more direct control. Maryland, on the other hand, happened to remain stable at that time, but that didn't mean that the people there were any happier. Some in the colony hoped that the king would overthrow the Baltimores and rule Maryland directly as a royal colony. A pamphlet, called The Complaint from Heaven and a Hue and Cry out of Virginia and Maryland, was even sent to England to argue the case. It was published anonymously, but probably written by Josiah Svendel. Josiah Svendel, if you'll recall, was the former governor of Maryland, who had sided with the Assembly against the authority of the proprietor before being removed from office in what was called a, quote, Pygmy Rebellion. In the wake of Bacon's Rebellion, Lord Baltimore ordered that the current assembly not meet for as long as possible, to give people time to cool down. Finally, in late 1678, the assembly was recalled, but the mood of the people was still against the proprietary government. One county even tried to elect former Governor Fendel to a vacant seat, even though he had been forbidden from ever holding office again after his little rebellion. In response to this obvious unhappiness, the leadership was relatively lenient, allowing the opposition to pass some desired legislation, including, according to David William Jordan, quote, a comprehensive statute on elections, which systematically restricted the proprietor's powers in that arena, placed the procedures of voting and the eligibility for membership under the jurisdiction of the Assembly, and brought the local electoral practices more in line with parliamentary precedents, end quote. The Assembly wanted to control its own elections, basically. Lord Baltimore allowed this to happen, but then he didn't call for another meeting of the Assembly for a further 3 years, until 1681, which would hopefully allow people to calm down for real this time, secure in the knowledge that they had won some victories. However, after things had settled down, it was time to take away some of those victories. Lord Baltimore vetoed that law about elections 3 years after the fact, along with a lot of the other legislation that the previous Assembly had passed, saying that it took away too much power from him as proprietor. He also had Josiah Svendel imprisoned for stirring up dissent, along with one of his allies, a delegate to the Assembly named John Coode. The two had been engaged in a lot of loose talk, speaking openly of how easy it would be to overthrow the government, and encouraging the colonists to not pay their taxes. Needless to say, discontent in Maryland shot right back up to where it had been before. In fact, Coode, who was free on bail, was even re-elected to the Assembly despite his pending charges. Lord Baltimore tried to get the Assembly to expel him, but to no avail. However, that was the worst of the disruption for the time being. There was no outright rebelliousness or anything. Coode wound up getting acquitted, but Fendel was convicted and sentenced to exile. He moved to Virginia and died there a few years later. Over the next few years, the Assembly met regularly but unproductively. The elected lower house and the appointed upper house were too at odds with one another to get anything done. The lower house still wanted control of its own election procedures, while the upper house was determined to block them. In 1684, Lord Baltimore left for England in order to fight William Penn for control of the western shore of the Delaware Valley, which was claimed by both Maryland and Pennsylvania. Baltimore had hoped to return to Maryland quickly, but he was forced to remain in England to deal with a much bigger problem than the fight over Delaware, a challenge by the monarchy to his control over Maryland. Although the Stuart dynasty was generally friendly towards Catholics like Lord Baltimore, that didn't stop them from attacking his charter as part of their broader process of standardizing colonial rule. This was at the same time as their attacks on the Charter of Massachusetts, after all. Plus, the governor of Virginia had even written to England with his worries about whether or not Maryland was stable, and whether or not its instability could have a negative effect on Virginia. And Baltimore's charter was seen as antiquated in general. In fact, it had seemed rather antiquated even when it was written some 40 years ago, drawing as it did on old medieval precedents. So it was to be expected that his control over Maryland would be coming under increasing pressure. The Crown did what it could to paint Baltimore's rule over Maryland in a negative light, playing up violations of the Navigation Acts and soliciting criticism from Virginia. The government proceeded to challenge Lord Baltimore's charter, and likely would have succeeded, but the process was interrupted by the Glorious Revolution, so the legalities all came to a halt. The future of Maryland was going to be decided in Maryland, not in England. Calvert had left the government in the hands of the council, which you'll remember is mostly Catholic. Let's just say they did a very bad job of running things in his absence. The leader of the council, George Talbot, literally murdered an opponent of the government who was also serving as a customs official in what was apparently a drunken fight. Talbot was convicted and sentenced to die, but he was then spared thanks to a royal pardon. Needless to say, the Marylanders were pretty displeased with all of this. His replacement, another Catholic named William Joseph, was also very unpopular. So Lord Baltimore was out of the country and the council was making a hash of things. The last thing Maryland needed was further destabilization. But in 1685, Charles II died. This didn't produce any immediate changes in Maryland, although the delegates to the Assembly became perhaps even more unruly than usual. The real shock happened in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. Like in Massachusetts, word reached Maryland of William's invasion early that next year. For several months, the council refused to acknowledge William as king, or even to acknowledge that anything unusual was happening in England. The leadership of Maryland was now in an extremely tight spot, given that their Catholic king had just been overthrown. It didn't take the Protestant majority long to take advantage. In the absence of concrete information, rumors were flying through the colony with nothing and no one to stop them. The Protestants became convinced that the Catholic leadership was plotting with the Indians to have them all massacred. Of course, there was no such plot, but it took a lot of effort by the government to convince people otherwise, and then conspiracy theories just started bubbling right back up. When 3 men were arrested for spreading rumors, a mob of 200 men rescued them. Partly this unrest was due to a communication breakdown with England. Lord Baltimore had actually sent orders that Maryland should recognize William and Mary, but the messenger died before leaving England. A second messenger was sent, but he may not have reached Maryland, since for whatever reason the colony still failed to proclaim William as king. After Virginia proclaimed William as king with still no action from Maryland's council, John Coode, the ally of Governor Fendall, formed, quote, an association in arms for the defense of the Protestant religion, basically an anti-Catholic militia. These associators waited a few weeks to get everything in order, and then they marched on the capital, St. Mary's City, with several hundred men. The council tried to defend itself, but their men refused to fight, and so the city was captured without bloodshed. A few weeks later, the council itself surrendered after being besieged on Lord Baltimore's personal estate. Just like that, the Catholic government had been overthrown. This rebellion apparently happened without any knowledge of what was going on in Boston or New York. The colonists in Maryland were just responding to a similar situation. Miscommunication and uncertainty led to paranoid fears about secret Catholic plots which seemed to require immediate drastic action. As part of the terms of surrender, no Catholic could serve in any official position in the colony whatsoever. This brought an end to Maryland's history of toleration for the time being. Maryland had been one of the first colonies to put religious toleration into law, but now that Protestants had firmly seized control of the government, they were determined to put an end to it. There would be toleration for fellow Protestants, but not for Catholics. The rebels, now the government, sent word to William and Mary, recognizing them as the rightful monarchs of England and hoping that they would agree to make Maryland a royal colony. They then called for new elections, to be held under new rules more closely matching those that the Assembly had previously been pushing for. Despite some concerns about the legality of all this, the elections were indeed held, and men who favored the rebellion generally won. The council was temporarily suspended since it was filled with Catholics who had been appointed by Baltimore. Not everyone approved of Cood's interim government, not even all the Protestants. For one thing, it had been carried out under false pretenses, since many of the strongest allegations against Baltimore's government, like the conspiracy to massacre Protestants, were pretty obviously false. And Cood had a bad reputation. According to David S. Lovejoy, Cood was, quote, a chronic agitator and perpetual malcontent, who seldom failed by his uninhibited outbursts to stir up both friends and enemies, end quote. And certainly there was more than a little self-interest in all this. Cood and his men wanted jobs for their trouble. Some of these opponents were imprisoned or had their property taken without due process. When one sheriff refused to call for an election within his county, he was charged with treason. However, there was no big movement against Cood. His interim government didn't last long enough. It took a full year for King William to decide how to settle things in Maryland, but in the end he decided to make it a royal colony. There were some hoops to jump through to make the revocation of the charter seem legal, but ultimately this was a political decision, so legalities wouldn't have been enough to stop it. The Calverts were out. Lord Baltimore's father had managed to hold on to Maryland in the face of revolution, but he could not. Honestly, if James hadn't been overthrown, he probably would have lost control of Maryland anyway. His position was just too hopeless, and his luck wouldn't have held forever. Getting rid of the proprietorship benefited both the king and the colonists. There was no one to oppose it. Anyway, Maryland was given a standard royal government, and the Assembly was given much more power than it had previously had. Only freeholders could vote, and Catholics were disenfranchised, although they still had freedom of worship. A number of the rebels were appointed to high office, and they made sure to take care of many of their old grievances, including finally passing those reforms to the electoral system. Whatever problems people had with the rebellion faded away as Maryland returned to its new normal. The next big fight was over securing a charter. Like in New York, the king had neglected to give them a charter which would guarantee them their rights and their government. The Assembly spent the next decade trying to get that charter, but to no avail. I guess the monarchy had become aware of how troublesome these charters could be, and how unruly they made the colonists. So Maryland too was left at the king's mercy. And that's where we'll leave it for now. With Maryland out of the way, there's one last rebellion to cover, in North Carolina. The settlements along the Albemarle Sound, which made up North Carolina, had been settled by poor but independent outcasts from Virginia in search of land, before the region had been absorbed by the larger colony of Carolina. As a result of the lack of interest from the proprietors of Carolina, the Albemarle was left without an operative constitution. This political confusion turned into a minor rebellion in the 1670s when the people of North Carolina rose against their purported governor. That then turned into a years-long contest over who was in charge, known as Culpeper's Rebellion. At the end of it all, North Carolina wound up with new leadership, but not much else had changed. You'll recall that one of the attempted solutions to Culpeper's Rebellion involved Seth Sothel. Seth Sothel became a proprietor of Carolina after buying out one of the original proprietors. He'd agreed to become governor of North Carolina, but on his way to America in 1678 he was kidnapped by Turkish pirates. Well, Sothel was ransomed in 1681, and he finally made it to North Carolina that next year to take charge. Because he was a full-on proprietor, he had more power than a regular governor. However, Sothel was not in the Albemarle to demonstrate his qualities as an administrator. He was there to make money. And that meant buying up land. Well, not even that. It meant giving himself a bunch of land for free under his authority as governor. He awarded himself a vast estate of tens of thousands of acres. This was an unfortunate contrast to how things had been done previously in North Carolina. The Assembly had even passed a law banning the creation of large estates like that, to keep the province from turning into a copy of Virginia. To maintain his power in the province, Sothel began awarding people large estates of their own, and appointing them to the council and as judges to create a faction loyal to him. And if anyone protested, they were likely to be taken to court, where they would now be facing an unfriendly judge. Bribery became commonplace. Sothel stole even more land from various colonists on flimsy legal pretexts. So when word came of the Glorious Revolution and then of the revolts in the Dominion of New England and Maryland, the colonists of the Albemarle decided that it was their time to act. The events of this rebellion are apparently rather obscure, but at any rate the colonists seized Governor Sothel and placed him on trial before the Albemarle Assembly. The Assembly sentenced Sothel to banishment from North Carolina for a year and forbade him from holding office again. The rebels then sent word to the other Carolina proprietors in England, explaining what they'd done and listing all their grievances. When the proprietors heard this, they agreed to suspend Sothel as governor of North Carolina. However, Sothel just went down to South Carolina to serve as governor there instead. But he only lasted 2 years before again being forcibly removed by the other proprietors for his mismanagement. He moved back to the Albemarle and died 2 years later. His replacement in North Carolina was a Virginian named Philip Ludwell. Ludwell, by the way, was married to the widow of old Governor William Barclay. If you have a really good memory, you might recall that Barclay's last wife had previously been married to another one of North Carolina's governors, Samuel Stevens. That's 3 colonial governors she was married to in 20 years. Impressive. However, Ludwell decided to not actually go to North Carolina, but to appoint a deputy in his stead. Just like with Culpeper's rebellion, this absence of proper leadership within the colony proved destabilizing. A prominent landowner in the colony, John Gibbs, felt that he had some claim to be governor himself. He raised a force of 15 or so men and captured some local officials. When Ludwell heard about this, he appealed to the acting governor of Virginia for assistance. The acting governor, who happened to be none other than Francis Nicholson, the guy who had been kicked out of New York during the revolt there, ordered both Ludwell and Gibbs to return to England so that the proprietors could sort this out. They went, and the proprietors duly confirmed Ludwell as governor. In fact, they made Ludwell governor of all Carolina, not just the Albemarle region. He now had to undo the damage that Sothel had done in both halves of the colony. The proprietors also made 2 big changes in Carolina. First, they gave both North and South Carolina bicameral legislatures, following the trend elsewhere in America. Second, they expanded the franchise to include all freemen, not just freeholders. Given how few servants there were in North Carolina, this was something close to universal white male suffrage. This wasn't the first time freemen had been given the vote, but it was a notable reversal of the trend towards restricting the franchise. Anyway, Ludwell left for South Carolina and a deputy governor was appointed to serve in the Albemarle. With Sothel gone and firm leadership in place, things settled down in North Carolina for now. In fact, there wouldn't be another rebellion for a full 20 years, which must be some sort of record for them. Compared to the rebellions in New England, New York, and Maryland, the expulsion of Governor Sothel was a small thing. There were no grand principles at stake, no charter to restore or Protestantism to uphold. Once again, an unpopular leader was ousted from the Albemarle, with considerable justification. Order was restored, but nothing fundamental was changed. Still, I thought it was best to include it, partly for the sake of completeness and partly to show that the colonies were in fact starting to move in sync despite their wildly different conditions. I mean, counting East and West Jersey separately, these rebellions impacted 8 different colonies. That's an awful lot. Things only remained unchanged in South Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania/Delaware. So what do these rebellions show about how political life in America has developed? Well, for one thing, anti-Catholicism was still very big. Fears of a Catholic takeover motivated rebellions in Boston, New York, and Maryland, as well as in England itself. Also, that the colonies were in communication and aware of their importance to each other. For instance, Leisler in New York and Coode in Maryland kept in contact about how best to suppress the supposed Catholic menace, and Leisler shared intelligence with Boston as well. The attempts by New York and New England at joint military actions were humiliating failures, but at least they were trying. I think that the biggest change is in how the colonists thought about their rights as Englishmen, or rather in how the English thought about the colonists' rights as Englishmen. In the early decades of colonization, the colonial charters had routinely, and without much thought, granted the settlers the rights of Englishmen, and that was how the settlers thought of it. They were in a foreign land, but they were still fundamentally Englishmen, and that didn't stop just because they crossed an ocean. New Englanders had at first argued on somewhat different grounds. They said that their rights came from their charters. But after the loss of those charters, they switched to justifying their actions in the name of their rights as Englishmen, just like everyone else. They weren't arguing in terms of natural rights yet. That is, they weren't saying that they had rights in some philosophical sense derived from pure reason. The rights of Englishmen were a traditional thing, something that they claimed as an inheritance from their ancestors. It may not have been sound history, but that was how they thought of it. Natural rights thinking was gaining ground, at least among forward-thinking people, but it wasn't yet common currency. Certainly it wasn't the sort of language you'd use to convince a king. So when the colonists in the Dominion and in Maryland tried to justify their rebellions to the king, they presented themselves as just doing the same things that King William had done during the Glorious Revolution. After all, if an argument was being used to justify the Glorious Revolution, surely that argument could be applied to revolutions in the colonies as well, since the colonies were just an extension of England itself. King William invaded to overthrow Catholic tyranny, and that's what the colonists said they were trying to do. What better way to portray yourselves as loyal subjects of King William than to say that you were merely following in his footsteps? But now, these rights were leading to knotty problems. For instance, one quintessentially English right was that all taxes be approved by a legislature. But what did that mean in the colonies? After all, no one was seriously thinking of giving the colonies representation in Parliament. So could Parliament tax the colonies? If Parliament could tax them, then the colonists no longer had the rights of Englishmen. If Parliament couldn't tax them, then in what sense was this a unified empire? If the colonial legislatures were in charge of taxation, then were they the equal of Parliament? Back in England, officials were slowly realizing the existence of these dilemmas, and at least some of them started to argue that the settlers were not Englishmen and were not entitled to the same rights, nor to representation in Parliament, nor to equal treatment in general. The colonies weren't part of England, they were just English property and could be used in whatever way would benefit England the most. You can see how tricky this was, and indeed these sorts of questions would lead to a war of independence in just 80 years. So, that brings us to the end of the Glorious Revolution in America, and the end of the first big phase of American history. We've come a long way from the founding of Jamestown some 80 years prior. Now, almost all of the original 13 colonies have been founded. Georgia won't be created for another 40 years, but other than that, they're all more or less here. In New England, we've got New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Rest in peace, Plymouth Colony. South of that, we've got New York, and below that, New Jersey, still split into East and West Jersey. And then Pennsylvania and Delaware, still unified but fast splitting apart. South of them, we've got the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia, and finally, North and South Carolina, still technically part of the same colony, but in practice completely independent from one another. The total population of all these colonies is over 200,000, and that's not even counting the other English colonies that didn't wind up as part of the United States. Massachusetts and Virginia alone each had 50,000 people. That's astonishingly big growth for only 80 years. The rest of the world has been busy while all of this has happened. In the 1630s, Japan largely closed itself to the outside world. In the 1640s, Manchu invaders overthrew the Ming dynasty in China. In the 1650s, the Dutch began colonizing South Africa and the Taj Mahal was completed in India. In the 1670s, John Bunyan published Pilgrim's Progress. In the 1680s, Isaac Newton published his theory of gravity. And now, in the 1690s, we're in the middle of the reign of Louis XIV in France and at the beginning of the reign of Peter the Great in Russia. Just to give you some perspective on the outside world. You can think of these first 24 episodes as something of a prologue. We have these different colonies clustered into different cultural regions. Puritans, cosmopolitan New Yorkers, Quakers, Cavaliers and indentured servants in the Chesapeake, plus the Barbados slavers in South Carolina. And of course we shouldn't forget that alongside all of these, the population of African slaves is slowly growing, forming yet another culture which will become part of the United States. There's only one major migration left, at least for colonial times, the movement of the Scots-Irish into Appalachia. But for the most part, the stage is set, the balls are rolling, the wheels are in motion. The next period will be about consolidation. Now that these colonies have been created and taken rudimentary shape, it's time for them to develop more fully, both culturally and politically. Throughout this period, colonial legislatures will really start to come into their own, often becoming more powerful than the governors. A new American-born elite will start to dominate political life, and the colonies will become more and more intertwined, not just economically but also intellectually, especially with the spread of Enlightenment ideals. The religious landscape will change as well, thanks to the coming of the Great Awakening, the first big revival movement in American history. Whereas before, religion in America was dominated by European imports, Anglicanism, Puritanism, Quakerism, and so on, after the Great Awakening, religion in the colonies will become more characteristically American, with periods of high religious enthusiasm and a great variety of denominations competing for parishioners. It's time to begin American history, Phase 2. But first, we'll need to jump back to England for an episode to discuss how the political system there evolved in the decades after the Glorious Revolution. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.